Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Wandering Road podcast. I'm your host, Chris, alongside my co host, Dean, and today is our Halloween episode, and we're going to be talking about the infamous and ever popular Salem Witch Trials. I'm looking forward to this one today, buddy. What about
Yeah.
yourself?
Don't tune out yet, everyone, because I we were talking about this for a while, and we had some topics lined up for Halloween, and they were all great. But the reason why we fell back to this classic Salem witch trial story is because we haven't heard anybody talk about it recently. And even though everyone in, probably a lot of people, almost everybody in the United States has heard of this to some degree, it's very much still rooted in popular culture. But the reason why we're going to talk about it is because there are some interesting aspects that you, as a historian, and me, as a nerd researcher, found out that probably a lot of people don't know. And the great thing about this is we discovered a lot of talking points that can take us in avenues that are extremely funny and or interesting. Stick with us during this conversation. That will be interesting, that you can kind of just spread around and talk to your friends about at least.
Salem Witch Trials were stupid. People are stupid. Episode done. Thanks for listening.
Yeah. Old times sucked. End. And they
People
really
are
did suck.
weird.
But let's set the stage. Okay. So you are Mr. Historian. How would you clarify, or how would you categorize, or just like basically give an overview of like the time, the place, the environment, like what happened? And then we'll get into the nuts and bolts of it, I think.
All right, everybody. Close your eyes. Are your eyes closed? Okay, good. Picture yourself in 17th century New England. You're in Salem Village or Salem Town. Just picture yourself in this world where barely any technology. Your family probably came over on the Mayflower. The area of Massachusetts, like the colony of Massachusetts, obviously there's conflict with, natives and stuff around there. But you are an average person living in Salem, town or village, and you're going about your everyday life. The reason you are in this location is because your ancestors wanted to flee England because of their religion. They
And
wanted
they're
freedom of
constant
religion.
orgies. They're
And they
constant orgies. We want to
No,
be free from all the sexualization.
that's the Romans, dude. No, but in all seriousness, it sounds like a really shitty place. If it does sound like a really shitty place, it kind of actually was. And they left England because, you know what? People aren't being nice to us because of our religious beliefs. So we want freedom of belief, freedom of religion to do whatever we want. So they come over to America. And what does that turn into? Puritanical, strict.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
a place that's just filled with religious strictness. You have superstitions. You're in a place where you're constantly on guard because if you live out in a village, you don't know bandits might come by that are former colonists that were banished for some reason. Native American war parties might come by because they're just pissed off that you're there. You live in a place where you're on the frontier. There's a lot of high anxiety. There's not a lot of wiggle room for, I would say, your own type of beliefs. It's a very rigid, structured of a system. Unless you make a shit ton of money, then rules do not apply. As with every time period.
And I'm also thinking about like the social structure as well. Like I'm trying to imagine, like, what would a person laugh and joke about when you're in an environment like that? So basically every task you do, if you're a normal person, you probably have in like a ramshackle. At best, you have like a cabin or some open area where you have maybe a room or two and a fireplace. At worst, you've got like a shack, right? And like everything you do, like you said, if you're not rich, you are doing that shit for like multiple hours, including making food or cleaning your clothes or like whatever you have to do for the day. Not Doesn't seem like there's a lot of downtime if you want to like have a decent life. What I think about socially and psychologically in this time period is like I wonder what people did joke about, did talk about. Was it always talking about like the dangers and the negativity that they were surrounded by? Or it seems to me like a normal response would be to look for any positivity. But like you said, I have a hard time fathoming any type of positivity that would truly exist. And I think that really frames out this story about unfolding, because to me, it's like a powder keg. If you're in an environment like this and you're just going along with like a generalized hope that you're going to survive the next day, but you got to put all this effort towards it. And then all the people, like you said, there's not a lot of trust. There's a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen. And so you don't have a lot of outlets that people need for like social engagement. I'm sure they had stuff, I'm sure they had like, the occasional get together and sharing of food or whatever. But I would imagine a place and time like this that's not a lot of laughter, not a lot of kids running around having like the best time of their lives. And if they do, they probably get pushed back into place by some dominant figure, like maybe like a male clergyman or like a male person in that society, like, putting them back in line because the dangers that do exist and stuff. So that's a good transition, I think, to talk about how this all started, which
Before
essentially.
we do that
Yeah, no, okay,
before
go ahead,
we
yeah.
do that, I do want to point out that witch trials took place in, if you want to call it, I guess, medieval Europe. Some famous people that were accused of being witches is number one, Joan of Arc. If you want to define what a witch was, yeah, you could take the the typical horror definition, right? You could pull up your Webster dictionary or your Oxford dictionary and be like, "Oh, a witch is someone that practices witchcraft, etc., etc., etc." Right? But when you go drill down to the core of it, a witch is somebody that stepped out of the bounds of societal norms that were put in place for control purposes, obviously, and for comfort purposes. Joan of Arc, a 16-year-old girl or 15-year-old girl, smacked the shit out of seasoned English commanders who were probably in their 30s and their 40s. How the hell do they cope with that? Well, obviously, she's a fucking witch. She's outside of societal norms. She's outside of what is considered normal for a woman at the time. I mean, in the Salem Witch Trials, you have your few men that are accused of being witches as well, which we will get to. But I think it's important to lay down that fact that this is not something new, but this is something new to the
America.
colonies, I would say.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, not America yet, but yeah, the
Not
colonies.
America yet. Yeah.
But I see where you're coming from. It's important to understand that the idea of witchcraft has been around for a long time. Even some famous people like Joan of Arc, they that label was placed upon them because, like you said, they were outside the norms of society or they did things that weren't easily explainable. But then, if you think about it from like we're in this time period, like even if you've never taken stats class or something like that, we know nowadays that there's such a thing as statistical probability. And when you have human beings, part of that function of nature and probability, you're eventually going to get outliers. And then outliers, maybe in the form of like a genius or something. Here comes like a 15-year-old girl who she just like crushes at chess. She is very capable of taking in information, remembering it, and not just doing that, but also understanding it and analyzing it. I think it's fascinating that when people in society who are in control and things start going in a certain direction that threatens their control, it's so easy to blame, right? And we just happen to be in a time now in this modern day where claiming people have some kind of league with the devil or witchcraft or something is like it's not pervasive because we don't live in that kind of society. But we do have that today where people will literally go on an AKA witch hunt. You don't like the other side doing something, you want to throw them off their kilter because they're harming or threatening you. And I'm talking about any side of the aisle or the table. It doesn't matter which side, any side. If you see like some people, if they see someone threatening their way of life or their well-being, they will throw everything they can to destabilize that person. That's so important to talk about initially and just bring it up, like you said, because we're going to get into the psychological aspects, but also the aspects that people might be wondering why psychological and paranormal kind of mesh together in the way they did during the Salem witch trials. So good observation. I like that, throwing it back to Europe.
It's important to talk about because that's where this shit spans from.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure.
And yeah, we talked about, we gave a brief background of like what life would have been like, but you can't forget the influence of Satan. Everything
Wow.
was Satan.
Yeah. Satan did it.
Always Satan. I mean, people do that shit now. But again, taking a step back, I know I've been cracking a lot of jokes about that time period and these people. Taking that step back, I think it's important to note that these people were highly religious. They were Puritan Christians. At the core of their beliefs was not only God, but Satan played a very important part. You had to do everything within your power to make sure Satan was not in your life.
Yeah, existential crisis thing, and to think about that for a second too, like, not only are you worried about Native American tribes or bears coming to maul your face off or starvation or whatever, you're also worrying about your eternal soul, and it's just like, that's terrifying, to be born into the idea of to be born into that environment. We digress a little bit. I do wanna mention upfront that there are some interesting points to the initial story that ties back into the idea that you're mentioning with, say, Joan of Arc or someone where the initial story surrounds young girls. The young girls, if you think about it in a social structure like this, in the same way you think about Joan of Arc, like, girls are subjugated, especially young girls. Women and, girls are subjugated in a male dominant society, and the reason why that's important is because when you start seeing strange events that happen to these women and girls, so it's surrounding these young girls, right? And these young girls, Elizabeth Parris and Abigail Williams, they are the ones who start experiencing these strange fits and behaviors. They're acting irrationally. And they're not just throwing a tantrum. They're not like, I want this thing or whatever, and they're throwing a fit. They're literally suddenly against everything that they normally do in a day-to-day life, how they usually act. They're just acting irrationally. Yeah,
Elizabeth, I believe, went by Betty as well.
absolutely. And the other aspect to the importance of these two girls, not just the fact that they were acting irrationally, but in my opinion, the most important, most significant aspect to this story is that Betty Paris was the daughter of Reverend Samuel Paris, the minister of Salem Village. And interestingly enough, Abigail Williams was his niece. Think about it. You got a minister, right? His whole life is focused on the word of God that he believes in and that the whole town believes in. So he's carrying this enormous weight on his shoulders. He's supposed to be the religious leader, which is the most important aspect of society at this little society at this time. You can fathom all day what he really believes and what his true demeanor was, but at the very fact of the nature is that he has this role in this society, and that's a lot of weight on his shoulders, right? Whether or not he actually saw and believed what they were going through or even fabricated it, he still had a key role in the fact that he was part of the society and he had to be the mouth to people about what was going on. Paris was definitely a polarizing figure. He was known for his sternness based off of what I read. He basically supported the trials. So I can't wait to get into this more because it really can go either way. Like, he either was a fabricator of this whole story, he wanted to, get something out of it, or he believed so feverishly in this world of like Christian faith and fighting the devil and witchcraft and all that stuff that he really invested into it, and he fed into this hysteria that spread out through the town. Do you have anything to add about Betty Paris and Abigail Williams, or even Samuel the father?
Focusing on the girls. So the reason that Samuel Paris came to this conclusion of bewitchment is because Abigail and Betty, or Elizabeth, whatever you want to call her, and other girls in the village began exhibiting erratic behavior, including screaming, contorting, and trance like states. He wasn't able to figure out why they were doing this.
Hmm.
So they can't find a physical cause. So obviously, the other alternative, this was supernatural.
Right.
This was bewitchment. This was done by the devil. This was work of the devil. This was work of witches. Witches, in tandem with the devil, are working to harm these children, to give them all these different types of ailments. How do we get to the shit show that are the Salem Witch Trials? These girls are pressured to name people responsible because throughout the trials, people make claims that they saw specters of certain women or other people in the village attacking them. So as a result, those people get accused. But the first few that are accused are Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne.
The first one that I would love to explore because it is just like to me, it's the nexus, like the key node into how all this shit started, like you said, spreading out throughout the village. But the Tituba woman, can you explain really quickly who Tituba was and what her role was in the Paris household?
So she was a slave from the Caribbean. She was a slave within the Paris household, and she had knowledge of African and indigenous folklore. And and this is important, Tituba was known to entertain the girls with tales of the supernatural. It would make sense to blame her first.
Yeah, because she's got all those
Logical
stories and
sense.
right. Yeah, she came
Yeah.
from a yep. Yeah,
Yeah. Some people guess like some of the stories spin it that like, okay, African slave, let's blame her first. She has to be in league with the devil. But I don't think she did herself any favors of sharing these folk tales and superstitions to the girls
or
because
confessing. Didn't she
or
also
confessing.
confess? Okay,
Yes, she did actually confess. Tituba confessed basically that she was approached by the devil
in a
and
dream, right?
yeah, she was approached by the devil in the dream, asking her to do her bidding, etc., etc. And then that when she implicated other people, saying like, you know, there are more witches working within the community. It's not just me. So it just
Yeah,
fucking like snowballs
yeah.
as we go on.
It sounds to me that people in this case are looking for an alleviation of their guilt in the eyes of the society around them by pulling in other people. And I think that's a natural human reaction. When you have a little kid and they get in trouble, what are they gonna like? Sometimes what do they do? Like, my kid or whatever, like if she does something, she might also blame one of her stuffed animals too, like it's like I think it's just innate in us, and I think that's probably what's going on initially where these girls had some kind of weird reaction whether it was like paranormal or not, and I can't wait to get into the physical theories about why they were having these fits, including the rye and the dog piss. So hold on for that later because it's a good story. It's a good
Ryan the
story. We'll get
dog.
you gotta hold that's our hook into to you listening the rest of this episode. If you want to hear that amazing part, you gotta hold on. So
Uh,
Tituba, she's like basically doing the quintessential human reaction where it's like, I'm in trouble. I'm going to get my shit screwed up. I'm going to get just absolutely obliterated in this. But if I pull in some other people, maybe I can get a lesser, like a reduction in my, my accusation or whatever
yeah, she thought. But
she thought.
yeah, the
Oh
same
God.
with the others that that confessed. So we talked about Tituba. Sarah Good was another one that was initially accused by Abigail and Betty. Sarah Good was socially ostracized woman who had been known for begging for food, and she was just hostile in her interactions with the townspeople in general. So there's another target. And then we have Sarah Osborne, who was elderly, but she had a history of scandal. She didn't attend church regularly, and she was also involved in property disputes. Here we have three people. What do they have in common? They are not viewed as part of the societal norm. And with Tituba, it was because of the knowledge that she had of indigenous and supernatural folklore. Two, Sarah Good, you had a woman that was outcasted from society. And three, you had Sarah Osborne, who sounded, I guess, more of a modern type of person that we would see today, where they didn't attend church regularly, where they were involved and had an interest in properties and business. Things that if women did, they were frowned on at the time. So those are three prime suspects to start with. And to them, the people back then would be like, these are not normal women. So they must be witches. They must be in league with the devil.
You know what's unfortunate too is as I'm reading about these women. By the way, quick recommendation is don't be named Sarah if you are in Salem. because that's kind of crazy, right? Like, I wonder if that played into any of the factors. Like, oh, Sarah Osborne, who's, Sarah Good. Oh, they don't name your kid Sarah. Like, I bet you no kids were named Sarah in the town for like 100 years after that, because that just seems funny and strange to me that both would be named Sarah and they're unrelated. But Sarah Good was around 39 apparently during the Salem Witch Trials. So and then I'll just mention briefly that Sarah Osborne was 49 apparently. So late 40s, early 30s, or sorry, late 30s, late 40s for these two women. You're probably already thinking this if you're listening, but like, consider the fact that that seems relatively young for us in this day and age, but in that day and age, that's you're probably getting up to like your that's on the cusp of getting elderly, right? Because I think people probably, if they would live to their 60s, if they were lucky. But what's actually fascinating is if you read about Sarah Good, Sarah Good's demeanor, and based off of what we have in terms of information and records about that time and the event itself, like she seemed she had a lot of intelligence. She had a lot of wherewithal, and even we'll talk about this later. But even she had a really interesting quote that she said to the judge before she was executed. It's important to also consider these two women as, even like you said, they were outcast in society, but they didn't seem by any means to be dumb. They were educated, at least somewhat. And so I think that could have factored into it as well, where, like you said, there are different type of vision in society as to what the norm was at the time.
Before we continue, I forgot to mention that the girls, when they had their quote unquote ailments of being and complaining that they were being pinched and pricked with pins, they were actually examined by a doctor who was assumed to be William Griggs, and he found no evidence of any ailment. So there's another reasoning there why they would assume that it was witchcraft.
Right. Yeah.
I personally think these girls were full of shit, but we could talk about that at the end.
Yeah. The fact that you talked about the doctor being involved initially, that gives me some hope and semblance of in the society that, even though it turned out shitty for everybody involved in this, but they did try to start with some kind of like empirical data based, as empirical as it can get back then, explanation for what was going on. I mean, if you think about it, like the doctor, like he could have been the savior of this whole story. He could have been like, yeah, they got some kind of like physical affliction from eating something or whatever. And they're just give him bed rest. And they could have like he could have nipped all this in the bud. After all these accusations flew, imagine society getting into a fervor. Think about nowadays, like if they like we have some kind of disease or something spreading, people look at COVID. I don't want to get too into COVID or anything, but like remember during COVID, people were looking for people to blame, some conspiracy theorists and all that stuff about where it originated and stuff. So essentially people are dying from this disease and it's controlling society. And then people flip to this idea that we need to figure out who started this. Even though it's kind of irrelevant until after the fact because it's not going to help you solve the problem. So it's the same thing in my mind to this whole Salem witch trial thing. It's like people start looking for outs because they got accused and then they have to roll the buck or pass the buck to somebody else because it alleviates, like I said earlier, attention from them. So imagine this is rolling through society. Anywhere from rich to poor people are getting the finger pointed at them. They're getting rolled up into these religious conversations about how to control this and like who is going to take the blame, who is really the cause of all this, etc. I think that the natural progression inevitably and obviously goes to a trial. And that's, I think to me, that's the most important and interesting aspect of this whole thing is like the trial. Like they actually are putting people in front of a judge and a trial and jury or whatever, and they're being hyper focused on and they're being scrutinized and put under pressure. And that's just exacerbating what's going on. And one of my favorite parts of the story, because I think it's so crazy, is they implemented this method during the trial to find out what was going on. It was called the touch test. Touch as in like literally touching someone test. And the way they did this was the person would be sitting there, and if they exhibited some signs of witchcraft, they were acting irrationally, they were speaking in tongues or whatever you want to say, however they were acting, the person who was being accused, a list of people being accused, would be asked to come up and touch them. And then if the afflicted person's fits stopped when the accused person touched them, then that person who touched them was guilty of witchcraft. And that is just the most batshit I mean, unless you blindfolded them and you had, like, a control, like, maybe you had a line of 10 people, and then the person, they were acting irrationally, and then the person who actually was accused of witchcraft, they touched them and they didn't know. But I still think that there could be some funky things going on with that where, someone whispered in their ear at some point, like, okay, just stop acting this way. And like once after the third person touches you and that sort of thing, like it's totally bonkers. What's your take on this whole trial? Like anything to add about the aspects of this trial? Because essentially it just seems to me like a kangaroo court where people were just doing whatever they wanted, and the political people in power were just looking for a way to close this shit out or solve the problem to ease the angst in society.
To me, yeah, it definitely is a kangaroo court. But real quickly, I want to return to Sarah Good real quick. So we talked about how, she was an outcast, dregs of society. Her early life, her father was well off. He was a tavern owner, had a 70-acre estate, but because she was a girl and her father had no will, basically got nothing, whatever little she had. Her husband, when she married him, William Good, he had debts and stuff. She did have a prior husband who passed away in 1682, Daniel Poole. So, because of her lower economic status, a lot of people didn't like the relationship that she had with her neighbors. Even her husband claimed that he feared his wife was a witch due to her bad carriage to him, indicating that he didn't like her demeanor. She didn't meet the expectations of a wife. She was also accused of challenging Puritan values. She was accused of possessing women. It's just like you said, a whole bunch of kangaroo court stuff. So eventually she goes to court and just just picture this, right? It's her trial. The girls that are accusing her of the afflictions or whatever of witchcraft, they bring in Sarah Good, and the girls in unison start rocking back and forth, moaning in response to her presence. Later in the trial, you have one of the accusers falling into a fit, and then eventually she stops, and then she claims that Good attacked her with a knife, and somehow she produces an actual broken off part of a knife using that as evidence and stating that, Good attacked her with a knife. It was broken off during a fight. What's crazy is you have a rare instance of human kindness where a young townsman stands up and shows the broken knife, saying, I actually have the other half of the knife. It was my knife and it broke off the other day. And he was like, you, the young girl making the accusation, actually saw it. But what happened?
Uh,
The judge simply scolded the girl for exaggerating the truth.
oh God.
Obviously, she denies the allegations. Good was allowed a chance to defend herself in front of 12 jurors in the Salem Village meeting house. She argued her innocence, proclaiming that Chichiba and Sarah Osborne were the real witches. But in the end, she was convicted of witchcraft and sentenced to death on July 19th of 1692.
I was hoping to, or I wasn't hoping, but like I was waiting to get to this later on, but I'll just mention it now because Sarah Good, whatever type of person
Oh, and
she
she was
was,
pregnant.
Jesus God. Okay. So you just ruined my, okay. So here's the thing.
No, they let
So
her
Sarah,
give birth first and then they hung her.
oh, okay. Well, okay. Well, then that,
And the
that's
baby
fine,
died to finish it.
What a terrible thing. Oh God. Okay. This is making me sad now. Just thinking
Hey,
about the
snap out
child
of
existing. Okay.
it.
No, I mean, okay. We talk about this stuff, but like we've said this before where we talk about like true crime and stuff, but we always have to like you can't escape the fact that these were real people who went through real shit. And that's really hard sometimes to fathom. This isn't just some fictitious story that we read in like a novel for people who never existed. But anyway, Sarah Good, I wanted to mention this briefly because, and now's my time to do it. She apparently had like the most badass quote to the judge who convicted her of being guilty of witchcraft and then the hanging. But she literally said, I don't know if this is verbatim, but the translation or something is like, I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, sir. and if you take my life, God will give you blood to drink. And that's so powerful, and it's very, I think it just shows her intelligence and her wherewithal. I mean, whether or not she was, I would be crying too, but like whether she was crying, but she still had the wherewithal to say this during her conviction, um, and her punishment, reading of her punishment, basically being put to death, and to just really put that into perspective. What's important and what she's getting at, I think, in her phrase is she knows she's not a witch. She knows that, all this stuff, she's not trying to pull one over anyone's eye. She's just caught in this unfortunate circumstance. And she's saying that, you guys and gals, all you people in society, you believe in the Bible and God and Jesus and all that stuff. And you're literally doing what God said not to do, which is kill somebody who's innocent. And if you kill me, you're putting me to death, and I know I'm innocent. You're gonna
And
get your
bearing false
comeuppance.
witness.
And false witness, and you're gonna get your comeuppance. I'm sure this isn't how it worked, but the I just imagine, like, in the movies, like, the judge is like, he just hits his gavel, like, "Oh, get her out of here," like, but then,
Hang her.
yeah, it's terrible, man. Anyway, but I have to say as well, as you were telling the stories, the backdrops of these people, and you're adding more flavor to the people who existed at this time and all the key players. That is so interesting to me too, because these were real people with real depth to their lives. They weren't just like toiling. They weren't just like going through their day-to-day lives without thinking deeply or doing anything meaningful. These are real people who had real aspects. And by the way, you said her father was a tavern owner. I am surprised that taverns were a thing in that time period, in that place. So that's actually really interesting that,
Oh, it definitely
alcohol and
was.
stuff, and
Taverns were always a
they were
key.
always a thing, right? Yeah, I could see that, but I still think that that's an interesting aspect, that this type of structure existed in this time and place, which all the portrayals of Salem Witch Trials in this era, it was just like doom and gloom, just, shacks and cabins and people working, toiling, 6 hours a day. Like, no, these people had some depth to their lives. There was a pretty vibrant structure to the ways people thought in society, clearly through, even if just through like someone like Sarah Good, who had that statement to say. These weren't
Yeah.
dumb people.
If you don't mind, I want to get into Sarah Osborne because
Okay.
we talked about Tituba, we talked about Sarah Good. I want to talk about Sarah Osborne because
Yes.
her background gives some more information as to why she was accused of witchcraft. And there's a few other people I want to touch on as well later on. And then we could talk about the badassery of Giles Corey.
Awesome.
So with Sarah Osborne. So Sarah Osborne was the one that was a little older. I think you said she was 49 at the time when she ended up dying.
She was 49 at the time of the
Yeah.
Salem Witch Trials. Yeah.
Yeah. So Sarah Osborne ended up marrying a well-to-do guy named Robert Prince. Prince was the brother-in-law of Captain John Putnam, who was a member of the notable Putnam family. So she moves to Salem Village in 1662. She ends up having two sons and two daughters. Her husband, Robert, dies in 1674. Shortly after he died, she hires an Irish indentured immigrant, Alexander Osborne, who paid off his indentured servitude, which was strange for at the time. She ended up marrying him. And as a result, her late husband's wish to carry over their 150-acre farm to their two sons didn't go through. Because she was married, she ended up upsetting social norms where she took over the property for herself and her new husband. Osborne taking of the property entered her into legal issues with her children. Putnam ended up being the executor of Prince's will, was also inevitably involved in these legal proceedings. So, not only do you have the fact that she didn't attend church regularly, which they suspected she was ill, she was still dealing with legal issues with the Putnam family, who was a very powerful family at the time. On top of that, she broke every societal norm. She was
By marrying an Irishman.
no, she married an indentured servant. Many in Salem knew about her fornication with Alexander by endeavoring to gain full ownership of her late husband's estate. She ignored the tradition of family alliances in Salem.
That's pretty crazy, right? That, like, you can
Yeah.
be part of a society where everybody goes to church, and if you don't go to church, you're raising some eyebrows. That's weird. That's a weird thing.
So here you have a collection of not collection, a series of events of her actions that would make it easy for her to be a target. It's like, look, this lady has put a black stain on us. We need a reason to get rid of her. Now they have them. They have the reason. So she ends up getting sent to jail with Tituba and Sarah Good. During her examination, she claimed that she was innocent and denied being involved with evil spirits or hurting the children. She did not confess, nor did she accuse anyone else. This contrasts Tituba's account, who confessed to the witchcraft and claimed that Osborne and Sarah Good participated in witchcraft with her. So Osborne ended up dying in jail on May 29th in 1692. Another
Yeah.
person that didn't confess.
I mean, it's really terrible. I mean, it sounds like even though she died in prison, like, not under being tortured or whatever, but it's still just as bad because apparently she had some health ailments that made her suffer substantially during her time in prison, and she wasn't getting adequate treatment and nutrition and stuff, so it was essentially like a long and slow death. I think that's in some ways darker than, like, the quicker torture deaths or whatever, because 'cause you're basically languishing in jail, and you probably know your life is over, you're too old, and you're not getting treatment and stuff, and no one's listening or helping you or whatever, so that's pretty rough, I think, and I am surprised that she didn't admit to anything because but then again, you have to think she was probably at least somewhat intelligent. She knew that if she actually admitted any involvement, that she would be killed, anyway, put to death anyway, so that's just a really shitty position for her to be in, um but yeah, I think it's interesting. It's an important part of the story because, like you said, she wasn't coerced to the degree that the slave was, Tituba. I think the fact that she didn't draw back on any of that or try to accuse anyone else is pretty noble, in my opinion. I don't know what type of person she was on a deeper level, but that's pretty cool that she didn't try to like throw shade at other people.
Now I want to jump to a few other people that were accused. So now we will go to Bridget Bishop, who was the first person that was tried and executed in the Salem Witch Trials. I did mention that a few others were executed earlier, like Sarah Good, where she was hung. Most of the people involved in the Salem Witch Trials, which I believe was 19 or 20 in total, ended up being hung or executed in some form or fashion. So Bridget Bishop. So Bridget Bishop was accused of bewitching five young women: Abigail, Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, and Elizabeth Hubbard on the date of her examination by authorities on April 19th of 1692. Her trial ended up lasting 7 days, and a record of her trial was given by Cotton Mather in his book Wonders of the Invisible World. Mather recorded that several people testified against Bishop, stating that the shape of Bishop would pinch, choke, or bite them. The shape would also threaten to drown one victim if she did not write her name in a certain book, which we would assume some sort of book of the devil in which you write your name in blood to become a witch or something like that. According to Cotton Mather, during the trial, anytime Bishop would look upon one of her accusers, they would immediately struck down, and only her touch would revive them. So another set of fucking bullshit. Another set of acting to me. More
Yeah.
allegations were made against Bishop, with one woman stating that an apparition of Bishop tore her coat, and upon further examination, it was found to be torn in the same exact spot. Cotton Mather mentions that the truth of many of these accusations carry too much suspicion, however.
Hader.
No shit, Sherlock. No shit.
See, there's like people in this whole story, like they're trying to maintain some semblance of like objective intelligence, but it's kind of like, it's still falling by the wayside, driven by like fear and superstition and stuff. And I think The more I hear about this time period, I think it's really just like this time period that we live in now, except without technology. It's pretty much the same thing that happens, and that really makes me not hopeful for human society.
I know.
Because you have, people like us and everybody else, like a lot of people listening, I'm sure, like there's a lot of people out there who are reasonable in a lot of regards, but it just seems like the thing that the people in society that make shit hit the fan for everybody else are the ones who get the most power. And like I just this is what's happening in this case as well. Like the people are in power, they're like, maybe I should apply some kind of objective reasoning to no. I say I don't want to piss anybody off. I better just go
And
along with this whole superstition
Yeah,
superstition
and
thing.
this is where the mob mentality takes over because you have Ezekiel Cheevers and John Putnam making complaints against Bridget, saying that she committed witchcraft. And Putnam said that Bishop called the devil her god, while other people such as Richard Coman accused Bishop of taking hold of their throats and ripping Coman and his wife out of their bed. William Stacy, a middle aged man in Salem, testified that Bishop had previously made statements to him that other people in the town considered her to be a witch. He confronted her with the allegation that she was using witchcraft to torment him, which she denied. And you have Samuel Shudock, another local, accused Bishop of bewitching his child and also striking his son with a spade. What the fuck? He also testified that Bishop asked him to dye lace, which apparently was too small to be used on anything but a poppet, a doll used in spell casting. John and William Bly, father and son, testified about finding poppets in Bishop's house and also about their cat that appeared to be bewitched or poisoned after a dispute with Bishop. Other victims of Bishop also recorded by Mather include Deliverance Hobbs, John Cook, Samuel Gray, and John Lauder. During Bishop's sentencing, a jury of women claimed to have found a third nipple on her, which they considered to be a sign of witchcraft. I know. Upon second examination, the nipple wasn't found, but in the end, Cotton Mather said that the greatest thing that condemned the bishop was the gross amount of lying she committed in court. According to Cotton Mather, there was little occasion to prove the witchcraft, it being evident and notorious to all beholders. So eventually, as a result, Bishop was sentenced to death and hanged, and she was the first recorded woman to die from hanging in the colony.
We should have mentioned this earlier, but as we're talking about all this stuff, I constantly have to imagine what people listening to this podcast would be wondering about the time frame for all this, and also the amount of people involved. It seems like a lot. It seems like as we're talking, you're probably getting this picture that all this is happening in a short time span. But one thing, like I said, we didn't mention was apparently the trial and all of this rigmarole took place over basically a year and a half. So that's a long, long time for all this stuff to unfold, right? And also another factor that's worth mentioning, and like you said earlier in the podcast, there's the Salem town, and then there's like Salem proper. But Salem Village was also kind of like a portion as well that where all this stuff happened.
Yeah, it
That
was
was
Salem Village
basically
and Salem Town. So Salem
right.
Town would have been like Salem proper.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So 500 to 600 people in Salem Village about around this time. That's not a lot of people, but comparatively speaking, based off of the number of people involved in the story, it's a pretty big number. So, have the bulk of people not involved in this, but people are watching and concerned. And then I'm sure it spreads to, like you said, Salem proper or Salem town, which is the larger, probably I would call it like a municipality or something of the area. So there's like 1,400 to 1,700 people at that size. And the entire area, including all the outskirts as well, who would have touched all of these stories and been at least aware of what was going on would probably be around 2,000 people. That's by no means any significant amount of people compared to today, but I think in terms of like the unfolding of all these events and the amount of fervor and just uncertainty and fear mongering, that's a lot of people to spread a lot of stuff to and reverberate within.
I want to quickly turn to I think this is probably one of the saddest accusations, which is the accusation of Rebecca Nurse, because she was 71 at the time. And
Jeez.
When she got accused, there was a huge public outcry because Rebecca was considered to be a very pious woman who lived in amity with her neighbors and had a reputation of benevolence. What's crazy is that 39 of the most prominent members in the community signed a petition on her behalf. The examining
Wow.
magistrates, John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, who normally regarded the guilt of the accused as self evident, took a notable different attitude to Rebecca's case. They told Rebecca openly that if she was innocent, they prayed that God would show her innocence, for it is a sad thing to see church members accused.
Mm.
So her trial began on June 30th, 1692. In accordance with the procedures at the time, Nurse, like others accused of witchcraft, represented themselves. They were not allowed to have lawyers.
Oh my
Could you
god.
imagine how fucking crazy that would be if they had lawyers? I don't think anyone would have been hung, to be honest with you. Could you imagine that? Holy
Oh, geez.
shit.
Yeah, like, yeah, well, I think if you had any kind of, like, lawyer who had any intelligence whatsoever, they would have also, like, been at risk of being accused because they probably were smarter and more knowledgeable than a lot of people in society. That's the other thing too that we don't talk about too much about this story, which is the judges themselves and the people who are, responsible for casting judgment or, whatever they're imparting basically a judgment on these people. They're probably not super knowledgeable about law because law really wasn't structured the same way we have it now. They were probably just winging it in a lot of ways. They didn't really have any jurisprudence or like any kind of like statutes or anything to follow. I have to say the reason that you and I chuckled is probably the same reason, but I'll tell you why I laughed at this really sad, terrible story. It's because the first thing I thought about was like, oh, all the wise people in society who are nice, they're the ones who get chastised and fucked over like first in a time of strife. And I was thinking back to that one old episode of South Park where Cartman gets thrown into the future. What was the animals that became sentient and
The
intelligent? Was it
otters.
the otters, yeah, and
They're
the
like,
wise one.
they
Remember the
listen to
wise
the wise.
one?
Kill the
Like,
wise one.
yeah, no, no, yeah, exactly. He's like, listen, otters, I have seen many ages, and I'm telling you now that we should all try to live in peace with everybody else. And all the otters, the younger ones, are standing around listening to him, and they look like they're listening. And then he goes quiet after his like long, beautiful spiel, and then that's when they say, what do they say?
Kill the wise one.
Kill the wise one, and then they just tear him apart, and it's just
Yeah.
like, God, it's like it's so obvious that this shit just keeps repeating. Like it's just a theme in society, and this poor woman got thrown under the bus at the end of her life. She deserves some recognition.
Yeah. And what's interesting in this situation is that she had many members of the community testify on her behalf. In the end, the jury ruled that Nurse was not guilty at first.
Oh, twist at first.
But due to the
On her
mob,
on her way out, she sneezed wrong, and they were like,
yeah,
"Ah, she's
right?
a witch!
She's
Achoo!"
a witch. Due to public outcry and renewed fits and spasms by the quote unquote afflicted, the judges reviewed the case and they changed their verdict and sentenced her to death on July 19th, 1692.
Oh my god.
Yeah. So,
What was her death? Hanging?
yes, yes.
Oh man.
Yeah. Die by hanging. If you thought the Rebecca Nurse one was bad,
Oh boy.
let's go to Mr. George Burroughs. And I find this one to be insane because Burroughs was a former minister who got accused of leading a witch coven.
What? So wait. Do we know when and why he stopped being that? Like, in the religious faith? Like, did he walk away from it? Or did he get cast out after the accusations started? Because that's an important part of the story, right? Like if he was part of the parish or whatever and he was active and then he got accused and then they kicked him out, that's one thing. But if he like left of his own accord, that seems very strange for someone to walk away from the cloth, so to speak, as they say.
No, so the reason that it says former minister is that he became the minister of Salem Village in 1680, but he became disillusioned with the community because they didn't fucking pay him. And then his wife died
Okay.
suddenly in 1681. So he ended up resorting to borrowing money from the community and to pay her funeral, and he wasn't able to repay the debt, so he ended up leaving in 1683.
Oh, man. So that's like imagine the people who had his debts and they watched him, like, get accused and like, "Well, there goes my hope of ever getting repaid."
Yeah, yeah, it's freaking insane. So Burroughs was arrested on charges of witchcraft on May 4th, 1692, based on the accusations of some personal enemies from his former congregation who had sued him for debt. At his trial, which took place in May, he was found guilty based on evidence that included his extraordinary feats of strength, such as lifting a musket by inserting his finger into a barrel, such feats of strength being presumed impossible with diabolical assistance. Lift weights, bro. You're
Oh my
talking about a
god.
dude in his 40s that was, like, probably well built at the time.
Yeah, but wait a minute, like, what? Like, what are you talking about? Like, you're sticking your finger in a musket and lifting it up? That's like saying, "I stuck my fist in a cow and I lifted up its back." Like, who would think to stick their finger in a musket and lift it up? If you don't know what a musket is, it's an old-timey rifle that, basically you had to, like, load each shot from the top, and
Yeah,
if it had a big opening for the hole of where the bullet came out, or the shell or whatever you call it, the musket, the ball, and he stuck his finger in the top of it and he lifted it up with his finger. And, most of the weight is down the rifle
by the
itself to
stock,
the butt,
yeah.
to the stock. And it's supposed to be really hard to be able to do something like that. But honestly, like I've held a musket before and that doesn't even seem like that crazy. That's strong, but that doesn't seem impossible to me just because everybody else was weak around him. He's just like,
Doesn't
he was
necessarily
born
mean
with
he couldn't
extra
do it.
strength. Yeah, like that's so silly.
Yeah, dude, it's like, "Well, I can't deadlift 400 pounds, that guy can,
Yeah,
so he
he's a
must be
witch.
possessed by the devil."
Next time you go to the gym, some dude's like, he's pressing 450. Like, he's a witch.
Witch! He is in league with Satan.
Oh, this is the funniest thing we've ever stumbled upon. I love this. This is
I
great.
thought it was gonna be super sad, but the more that you talk about it and listen to it, it's like
Yeah.
people there had to have known this is fucking bullshit, but they didn't say anything because it's like, "Fuck, I don't wanna be next." And that's
Yeah.
where you get into the whole mob mentality bullshit in which something is fucking asinine. It
Yeah.
doesn't make any sense. It's built on a foundation of fucking lies, but people are too fucking afraid to say anything because they're gonna be next.
Yep.
Fuck, I don't wanna die. Yeah, he's a witch, whatever. I gotta go fucking feed my cows. Alright, I'll be right back. Enjoy your trial. Like, that's really if you had to really simplify it,
It is. I
that's
think
how I
so.
view
Yeah.
this shit. Like, out
Totally.
of all fucking people, you accuse a pious elderly woman who is probably gonna die in the next 5 years anyway, and a fucking former minister who owed people money. That was the main crime here. He couldn't pay him back. They probably wanted to kill him anyway.
Yeah.
So it's like, you know what? Just fucking accuse this guy. You know, let's let's get rid of him. So other accusations he had was his failure to baptize children or attend communion. He was also suspected of killing his wives by witchcraft. And although clearly witchcraft was not involved, it seems like there's historical evidence that this guy was a dick and did treat them poorly.
Oh, okay. So he got his comeuppance a little bit, I guess, but uh,
Yeah, yeah. So he ended up being sentenced and executed on August 19th, 1692. And you know what's interesting? One of the methods that they use to accuse someone of being a witch is they would have them recite the Lord's Prayer. If you could not recite the Lord's Prayer, that was a clear indication that you were a witch.
wow.
Burroughs, at his execution, recited the Lord's Prayer, which some believe that a witch could not do, but his efforts didn't prevent his hanging. So even if you pass the trial,
Yeah.
it doesn't fucking matter. It really
Damned
didn't
if you
matter.
do. Literally, damned if you do, damned if you don't.
I know we talked about 6 people, there were 19 or 20 people involved in the executions,
That's
but
insane. I
yeah,
had
but
no
those
idea.
those 6 are, kinda, like, really, I think, highlight the core of the accused, I would say, showing, like, different people from different aspects of life
Yeah.
and different reasons as to why they could have been potentially accused by the community, but there was one more guy I wanted to talk about.
Please say it's Giles Corey.
Yes, it is.
Okay, because
You
that's the
wanna
one
take
we
go into this one? I will
okay, I'll
leave the
you can
gals
add
story to
to
you.
it, I'll just give the synopsis up front, but, this is the one we talked about initially when before we started this, for everyone's awareness, we were talking about at some point, we wanna talk about the torture that happened, and we didn't really talk too much about torture during this, which I think we could touch upon, including this part, because it's important, especially with, like, the crazy things like the witch cakes and the river dippings and all that shit that happened, the crazy I can't even imagine how they came up with this shit. Giles Corey, in a nutshell, he was husband to Martha Corey, and she was also apparently accused of witchcraft at some point. Essentially, what happened was he was accused of harboring his wife, who was a witch. He was basically put to death by a method of torture that in French is, I think I'm going to say it right. I'm not sure. It's like peine forte et dure or something like that. And it's basically translated to pressing with heavy stones. And if you're not familiar, you can look it up. It's a really, really heavy torture, no pun or all pun intended. Basically, you're lying down flat on the floor and they put a plank on your chest and they continue to add heavy stones to that plank until you can't breathe and or it collapses your chest and you die. So Giles Corey, the other aspect of this that is important, Mr. Chris has corrected me on recently, is he was 81 years old. 81 years old when he had all of this crazy weight put on his chest. And as they were adding stone, he managed to muster screaming out the phrase, "More weight!" as he was being crushed to death. It's badass in a way that imagine you're 81 years old. Like you've outlived everybody else in your life. Probably there's nobody else left in his life that he even loves that much anymore. You know that life is a joke at that point and you're going to die. And you're just like, I'm going to go out with a bang. And so he taunts his torturers by saying more weight. He survived for 2 days as he was being crushed, which, agonizing pain, not being fed or nourished in any way. I wouldn't even be surprised if he didn't die of, like, say, dehydration or something instead of the actual crushing. He actually, at one point, was all snarky and he asked for more weight on his chest. So, I don't know. You got anything to add to that story?
Yeah, actually, his wife was hung 3 days later on
Oh,
September
God.
22nd.
So
Oh,
she was still being accused of being a witch.
so fucking insane.
Yeah.
But the thing is that this is where we see the decline because Martha and Giles Corey were seen as affluent members of society. They weren't really bad people, even
Wow.
though Giles Corey did some stuff in his early life where he got accused of like beating an indentured servant to death, stuff like that. So we had the public nature of Giles Corey's death. You had the death of his wife, Martha. And that kind of started to quell the flames of the accusations and the witch trial in general. I think the final nail in the coffin for the witch trial was when Governor William Phipps's wife, Lady Mary Phipps, was accused of witchcraft. After he was accused, Phipps ordered that spectral evidence and testimony would no longer suffice to convict suspects in future trials. So the
Damn.
governor was like, this is fucking enough. It took his wife being accused for him to actually do any type of governor duty in this type of situation. You think the governor would be like, what the hold the fuck? What is going on here? We got people accusing people left and right. But yeah, the final nail in the coffin, I think, in this entire situation, it took a governmental official to have their family member, their wife, accused of witchcraft.
Right.
But I know you've been chomping at the bit to talk about what was it? The cake, the witch cake?
The witch cake test. This is what we alluded to in the beginning with the best part, in my opinion, of this whole story. I love this aspect of the story because to me it's dark, but it's also whimsical. So if you're not familiar, here is the crux of what the witch cake test is and how it worked. So, in a nutshell, the way that they would figure out whether there was some kind of witchcraft involved was some kind of old European-based superstition that dogs somehow, and cats, but dogs in this case, have a greater sensitivity to the spiritual and the paranormal, which is a whole other story, like a whole other thing we could talk about in and of itself, because we've talked about this before, where animals, stories of animals being aware of things that might be paranormal, dogs looking at doors before some weird event happens, or barking at something that's not there. You have stories like that. But basically, the witch cake test is they would take a clump of rye and they would essentially make a cake out of it. But a key ingredient that made this whole thing work was you had to get the person who was afflicted by the witchcraft to piss into the mixture. So 2 parts rye, 1 part piss. I don't know, like, how they, handled the smell of that. I can't even imagine what mixing, flour, rye, and all that shit would smell like with urine.
Why don't you find
Um,
out and let us
yeah,
know?
it's gonna be a project, my wife's gonna come home and be like, "Oh god." Gonna have to burn the house down. "Don't worry, I'll feed it to our dog." So basically, they would make this cake out of urine and rye. By the way, I don't even know what kind of like cake you can make out of rye. That sounds like a terrible cake. But they would put piss in this rye, and then they would make this platter out of it, this dessert. I know what you're thinking. It sounds like they're going in a direction where humans are going to eat it, but nope. They're going to feed it to a poor dog who is just probably starving at this time period constantly. And the whole thinking behind this was that if the dog acts irrationally or out of character in any way after eating this, then there is some witchcraft involved. And the person who pissed into the cake is being affected or afflicted by witchcraft. And this is so great to me because if you feed a piss cake to a dog, of fucking course it's going to act irrationally. It's gonna run around in circles or vomit. Like, it's like, what are you thinking? Of course it will act like, it's just crazy to me that someone. But here's the thing I learned about the witch cake test. Paris, who, if you remember correctly, earlier on, he's the reverend and all this, or whatever, the holy person involved in this story initially. He actually did not sanction this test like I thought originally. I thought that this test was accepted as a way to detect witchcraft. However, it's not. It's not something that's part of the faith, the Christian faith at all. It's actually, he actually deemed it as paganism. And there were people in the society in that day, including Paris, who said that, no, I don't want to do this. This is not right. This is not going to help us. This is going to call forth evil before it helps us. What's interesting about that is it still ended up becoming a method by which they tried to figure out what was going on. So Paris, like I said, did not think that this was a sanctionable way to, or a religious way to figure out if there was witchcraft, but it still happened. And what's interesting is the way that this came about, this method that rose through society to be an option to test for witchcraft, came from a woman named Mary Sibley. Mary Sibley, which, by the way, I'm thinking now it'd be so funny if she ended up being the witch in all this and she like totally didn't catch any flack for it. But she basically was the one who suggested this practice. And I don't know how she would have been aware of this practice. I did some preliminary research into this witch cake test, and it can be traced back to European lineage. So it's something that has been, it's not, I thought initially that they came up with this shit on their own, which would have been hilarious. But essentially, this actually came from folklore all the way back to older European days. So this story would have come over from England or Europe or whatever over to the colonies. Mary Sibley convinced them to do this test, and they go through this test, and it's kind of disappointing. The results are inconclusive, right? They think that there are some signs that there's some
I
witchcraft
wonder
going
why.
on. Yeah, I wonder why. The dog gagged, and they're like, well, maybe they had some reason. Like, well, he did eat some piss cake. So, um, but I'll finish with this. I don't want to. I don't want to draw this out too much. I think that the story speaks for itself, and it is funny, and it's like a nice little anecdote. But one thing that I wanted to clarify personally was, why did they think that dogs had some kind of like spiritual sensitivity to indirectly show signs of kind of witchcraft involvement? And the reason is because that belief has been around even like all the way back to the ancient days of Europe when witchcraft started becoming more prevalent and more suspicion came from crazy stories of the supernatural and people harnessing evil forces. So dogs apparently are seen or were seen as familiars. So when they say familiar, they're basically talking about like a helper. Basically, there was a belief for a while that witches would use cats and primarily dogs as helpers to go fetch materials or to be scouts or to do something, which, if you asked me, I would imagine a crow or something. That's how we portray it now. But I guess dogs could be like considered as evil or, harbingers of evil or whatever, or being able to be manipulated by evil. But of course, nowadays we don't have. I would say a cat nowadays is more aligned with that ideology than dogs. Dogs are just fucking awesome. One more thing I'll say is that I think it's funny that human history has dogs as mostly positive because they were with us from the inception of um, you know basically nomadic humans, and they came to our campfire and we fed them a little bit, and the wolves kind of morphed into dogs and the dogs were loyal. But it's funny how this little blip in human history, dogs were seen as potentially evil and sensitive to evil forces. And I think that that's how this whole cake test came about, especially in the colonies, because they were desperate and they were reaching for some way to read or interpret what was really going on and to find out who the witches really were. So if we had time, I would do this, but we don't have time. Maybe I'll do this by myself, but I want to learn more about Mary Sibley because there's a part of me that is suddenly suspicious about her role and her guidance and all this. Not saying she's a witch, but just saying that it would be interesting to find out because she kind of like dropped in, suggested this crazy ancient ritual thing or this test thing, and then she dipped out.
Yeah. So it's funny that you bring up Mary Sibley because if you ever watch the show called Salem, she's actually the most powerful witch in Salem. So
Well, holy shit, my inclination was no, I'm just kidding. It's
no,
all
but
it's
yeah,
all
if you
bullshit,
watch the
but
show, it's pretty good. Listeners,
yeah.
watch that show. It's actually really good. I think you'll like it. And it's not a show to be watched around children because there are some raunchy parts to it. So
Mm.
yeah, don't don't watch it
Little
around
witch
your kids.
little
As a
witch
matter of
on
fact,
witch
don't listen
action.
to this episode around your
Wi
kids, please.
witch on wizard action.
Maybe. But
Gross.
but but before we end today, I want to quickly run down the list of victims that were convicted and hung and well killed um, by the accusations of the Salem witch trial. So we have Bridget Bishop, Sarah Good, Rebecca Nurse, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe, Sarah Wilds, George Burroughs, Martha Carrier, John Willard, George Jacob Sr., John Proctor, Martha Corey, Martha Esty, Ann Podiater, Alice Parker, Mary Parker, Wilmot Red, Margaret Scott, Samuel Wardwell, and also Giles Corey, who is not hung but pressed to death. There were additional deaths in jail: Sarah Osborne, Roger Toothaker, Lydia Dustin, and Anne Foster. These individuals represent the tragic toll of the Salem witch trials, a dark period that resulted in wrongful deaths due to fear, prejudice, and a flawed legal process. But to end on a positive note, in 1710, William Good successfully sued the Great and General Court for health and mental damages done to Sarah, ultimately receiving £30 sterling, one of the largest sums granted to the families of the witchcraft victims.
Wow. Yeah, you never hear about the after effects or the aftermath, but that's interesting socially, right? I mean, people kind of admitted that all this shit that they went through for a year and a half was just redonkulous and completely misled. And I will say this is the last thing I'll say about this. If there is a devil, and if there is all that shit, like like religion and stuff like Catholicism or Christianity, let's just say that realm does exist. um I would imagine the devil would be laughing at all of this shit because it's like, imagine it's like, hey, devil, like tell me about the witch trials. Like who really was the witch that was doing all this stuff? Who did you really, um, add into your ranks to do the witchcraft?" He's like, "Nobody. I didn't do anything. I wasn't even a part of that. I didn't do any of that shit. Like, that was all humans. Like, that was all them." And, I just imagine, like, this is, like, the worst case of that happening in human history where humans just made the worst case possible materialize, and there was no actual semblance of reality based in any of it. What's your final thought on that?
Last thing I'll say, it's funny that you bring that up because that's kinda something we talk about with JJ all the time, right? Who's actually responsible? At the end of the day, who is responsible for their actions? You are responsible for your own actions unless there are certain circumstances. The devil didn't make you do it. You did it on your own accord because you got something out of it. And with the Salem Witch Trials, the same thing with the whole Arnie Johnson case and the son of Sam, who said that his neighbor's dog was talking to him, telling him to kill people. Same concept applies. Salem Witch Trials, devil made me do it case, son of Sam. At the end of the day, it's your own responsibility. Whether the devil told you to do something or not, you still had to act on it. And
Looking at
that is
you,
my final
Salem.
thought.
Looking at you,
Looking
Salem.
at you,
Yeah.
buddy.
Yeah.
But by the
Um,
way, Hocus Pocus is one of the greatest films ever. So,
oh, yeah.
um,
I love that movie, man. Oh my god.
yeah. And
You
if
know
you
what I
want
just
to,
watched? Oh, god.
yeah, go ahead, go.
You know what I watched recently with my daughter? Halloween Town. Have you ever seen
Oh, I
that movie?
love that fucking movie.
That was such a great movie in my childhood that I completely forgot about, and I stumbled across it on Disney Plus, and,
They
I
have
think
all
it's
of them.
still they have all of them, right? Like, I
Yeah,
still think well, to me, I watched 1, 2, and 3, I think there's 4, but I think number 1 to me is still always gonna be my favorite because the thing that caught my eye the best in that movie was the masks and the makeup that they had for all the monsters in Halloween Town. Like, that was the most fun to see for me. And also, if you pay attention, there were some weird similarities between Halloween Town, which came out before Harry Potter 1, and, uh, and I think it's funny to compare, who did it first sort of thing. It's kind
right.
of creep not saying that the book itself was, ripped off from Halloween Town, but maybe there was some kind of copying going on for the people who made the movie. So
Yeah,
that's an interesting talking
yeah.
point.
Speaking of movies and a book, if you really want to get like a dramatic version of the Salem Witch Trials, I would suggest reading The Crucible and watching the movie that came out in the early 90s. Daniel Day Lewis plays John
Oh, he's
Proctor.
in that? Oh,
Yeah,
wow. I would
yeah.
totally watch that.
Really good movie,
Nice.
listeners. So read The Crucible and watch the movie The Crucible.
I might watch
I
that tonight.
highly
And
recommend it.
this is the perfect time, we can keep this in or cut it out. It's up to you. But I'm gonna put this out to the listeners here. And I doubt, we're probably gonna this is the end of the episode. People, if you're still tuning in, thank you so much. But if you are tuning in and you feel like reaching out to us, I want to get an idea of if any kind of flavor or interest to our from our regular listeners. Would you like to hear us talk about scary movies? Or even watch us play scary video games and provide the brilliant and if not dumb idiotic commentary that we provide normally. I think that there's a flavor that we add that seems more colloquial and more interesting than just talking about events. Like when we're just riffing, I think we do the best when we riff. So I'm going to put it out to the listeners. If you want to hear us do reviews of scary movies, old or new, or you want to watch us play some kind of scary themed video game, maybe even show our face eventually, because I think that's how we're going to take the next step up, right? Showing our faces and talking while we're doing that. Let us know. Please reach out to us, even if it's just a quick email saying, fuck yeah, review movies, review video games, play video games. We want to see that. I want to see more of that. Let us
Or
know.
even suggest movies for us to watch that
Suggest
you want us
movies,
to
suggest games.
review.
Please. Yeah, we will do this stuff for you if you like hearing our idiotic banter.
Clearly, almost 1,000 people a week enjoy hearing our
Is it
stupid.
really up to that already? 1,000 people?
Yeah, yeah, dude.
That's crazy.
Yeah, our
We
numbers.
need
We've grown organically, and I'll take the time to thank everybody. Like, if you're still listening to this
oh my
episode,
god.
uh, today, like it. it's crazy. We've been doing this for over a year now. This coming March of 2025 will make it 2 years. So super fucking awesome. We're pushing close to 100 episodes. So, it's all surreal. It feels great. It's enjoyable. We love doing what we do. We love talking about these topics, and we would love to explore more avenues, like whether it be movie reviews or, just streaming horror games. If that's something you're into, yep, please shoot us a message, let us know, and we'll be more than happy to do that.
I wanna say too, we wanna make you all happy, honestly. Like, we wanna do this because it's something we enjoy and we wanna be successful at it, but we never lose sight of the fact that this is, some kind of form of entertainment, but it's not entertainment that's being just thrown at you, right? Like, we wanna try to make you feel like you're a part of the conversation, and that's why we always try to invite people on and stuff. So if you have any insights, if you have anything to add, just shoot us an email. We're always happy to read it and maybe even send you a response and get you on the show at some point. But basically, please support us. Like, we want to do this all the time, and we want to give you as much as possible. So if you could find a way to support us and through any means possible, we have all kinds of different ways to do that. Just let us know, reach out, do whatever. Thank you again. Chris, I'll give you the final word.
Yep. Hope you guys enjoyed today's interesting take on the Salem Witch Trials. I know we didn't really focus on the paranormal aspect of it because a situation like this, I think it deserves a deep dive and commentary. But again, if you've lasted this long throughout this episode, thank you for sticking around. We do enjoy everyone listening to the show. If you want to be on the show, go ahead and reach out to us via our email or social media. And unfortunately, this Halloween episode, when it releases, it will be the day after Halloween. So when you listen to this episode, I hope you and your family have a great and safe Halloween and steal all the candy from your kids.
Happy Halloween.
Thanks for tuning into today's episode of The Wandering Road. You can find us on Apple, Google, Spotify, and most podcast platforms. Be sure to subscribe and share. Also, don't forget to give a follow on Instagram at twroadpodcast and follow my TikTok at twrpodcast. Take care, and I'll catch you on the next one.